Hi, everybody. Welcome to Wealth is a Team Sport Live. I would just like to say I'm so glad to have you because we're going to have an amazing interview today talking with our expert guest, Gena Cox, about diversity and inclusion. And it's just such an important topic. I know everybody listening is going to really take away some good information for how do you handle this tough topic. And I can just tell you, I was really pleased. I met Gena recently through a speaking class that we were doing together. So we're in totally different spheres and worlds, but we're having this passion for communication. And so I'm excited to get to share her expertise on her topic of diversity and inclusion for today. So for those of you who are brand new, I'm Tara Nolan, and I'm known as the advisor that helps you achieve and retain the lifestyle you want. And so you may be going, hey, wait, this is a money show? No, it's not a money show. What I like to do is I like to bring value to people's lives. And so I'm having these interviews with very interesting people on interesting topics. And so today we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. So let me go ahead and introduce Gena so that you can understand what kind of an expert that you're going to get to talk with today. So Dr. Gena Cox is an organizational psychologist, an executive coach, and a keynote speaker. She has worked with Fortune 500 leaders for over 20 years to help them build cultures in which managers respect, develop, and elevate all their employees. Gena imagines a day in which the term diversity and inclusion becomes just another name for great 100% leadership. She encourages top leaders to lead this change, as she explained in her recent Harvard Business Review article. So welcome, Gena.
Tara, I am delighted to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And for your audience, I want you to know the main reason is not because I want to talk about this stuff, although I love doing that. I just enjoy this opportunity to interact with Tara, who is so delightful, as you already know.
Oh, I love it. So just we're just going to jump right in today, Gena. So just we kind of level set the audience so that we're all kind of talking the same language and coming from the same place. Diversity and inclusion. When we hear those words, like what picture do you want to pop into someone's mind when they hear this phrase in your ideal world?
Yeah, because people tend to get very confused and they commingle those two things, and they really mean completely different things. So I think of diversity as something to do with counting. So when I use the word diversity, for example, we're thinking about the various ways that people differ, whether we're talking about race, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ status, age, and a variety of ways that humans vary. And when you're thinking about those things, especially in a business context or an organizational context, I'm thinking about them in terms of to what extent is that variability that you see in the general population represented in that particular organization or team or group that we're talking about. So diversity has a lot to do with representation of whatever variable it is that we're talking about. Now, inclusion, on the other hand, is all about the experience. So when I think about inclusion, the question that I want to ask leaders is, what does it feel like to work in your company every day? And what does it feel like to do business with your company every day? If I were to talk to customers and employees and ask them that question, they will answer it. And their answer will let me know exactly what kind of an experience they're having as they interact with the organization. So inclusion is about, do I feel respected? Am I being, do I have access to the opportunities? Am I getting the promotions that others might be getting? It's really all about how do I feel within that environment as if I am part of it and not sort of off to the side, regardless of what aspect of diversity we're talking about.
So that I have a question about that. So I've actually been thinking about this. So like diversity, there's the very obvious visual, like we can look at skin color. But does diversity also include like different backgrounds? Because, I was raised in rural West Virginia, and I had a lot of family from Long Island, New York, and from the city. And talk about that was diversity to me.
Yes, it does. In fact, my last call that I just got off of was talking about a company that's headquartered in Finland. And so we were trying to have this conversation, and we first of all have to level set about what are we talking about, because race and ethnicity is not as interesting to them because of the nature of their population. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And so, yes, definitely. When you talk about Kentucky versus Long Island, I think and I said Long Island on purpose. I
You're
think
correct.
that everybody understands that we all have different experiences. So when I think about diversity and inclusion, I'm actually thinking about all of that, because in fact, the biggest transition personally that I have had to make with regard to these issues, though it was related to race, had more to do with the fact that I spent the first 20 years of my life in a completely different country. And when I came to the United States, I was fully formed. I knew who I was. I blah, blah, blah. And then I had to learn how to adjust and figure out how to fit in the United States. And that was an example of sort of my difference coming here, and then sort of, will I be included or not? So it could be that. It could be differences with regard to, the education and things that you're exposed to. Yes, it includes all of those things.
So that brings me to another question I have. And I really appreciate you having this call, because my background is military, much more than it is corporate in this terms. So one of the things, like in the military, when I was in pilot training, it took me a while to realize the goal wasn't to teach everybody how to fly. The goal was to say, we want you to fly an airplane the way we tell you how to do it, and learn it as quickly as we tell you how to do it. So that's kind of the opposite almost of diversity and inclusion. It was like, okay, this is exactly what we need, and it's much more cookie cutter. So, and the military is very specific in some of the roles. So I was just kind of thinking about that. But then we know also that teams are stronger when you have more different people, because if everybody thinks the same, that doesn't help you innovate or grow. So what is your thought about, like, how do you find that balance? Because I'm sure it's the same in corporations too, because whatever your mission or your product or whatever you're selling, you have to have that streamlining effect of getting good return for your effort. But at the same time, you want to have these different ideas.
Well, first of all, I think you answered your question when you talked about that military perspective, because what you clearly said was that the first thing the military said is, here's the outcome that we desire. So regardless of the environment that you're in, I think the very first thing that has to happen is everybody has to be clear about what it is that we're trying to accomplish overall. Now, within that, we will have our standard processes. Everybody will do it this way, da 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 da. And then you need innovation, right? Because especially if you are in a for-profit business, you have to have the innovation that is necessary so that you can, stand out amongst your competitors and so on. How you get that innovation isn't typically by everybody just doing the same thing over and over every day in the same way. So regardless of the environment that you're in, innovation does require making space for people who have ideas to express those ideas. And that is an aspect of psychological safety that you probably have been hearing a lot about in the last several months. But the reality is, you cannot have inclusion, you cannot have innovation, you cannot have new ideas, you cannot have that sense of we are growing and thriving unless you have a variety of ideas and make space for that. So leaders have got to allow people to sort of raise their hands or however they choose and make space for them to express their ideas and do things differently.
And so just to dig into that a little more is, I know in the military, we take this very seriously. We have actually, there's a whole officer that's responsible for dealing with diversity and inclusion, but it still always feels a little bit awkward because people want to get it right. I mean, I think generally in everyone's heart that I've met, people really want to get this right, but then they're like, like they don't know how. So how do you address that, especially as a person and then as a leader?
Yeah. So first of all, get it what right? That's the first thing I say to my clients. What is it that you want to get right? And then the next thing I say is have no fear. You can do this. That's the second thing I say, because what I experienced is a lot of fear and anxiety and frustration around this issue that I understand, but I also believe can be sort of taken care of, can be alleviated. So there is no one solution that a client of mine or that a company can pick out of the air, out of the ether, and say, do this, end of story, and you're done. It just does not work that way. So the important thing is for the organization to really be clear about what it is that they're trying to solve for, which means they have to know what is the current state of affairs. Now, big organizations, I don't know about the military in that way, but I think this is part of what you are describing, is that with a large organization, you're going to have a lot of standardization about the things that you do and the questions you ask and so on. And there is, frankly, a lot more focus on diversity in federal organizations than on inclusion. So the minute that you said what you said, what I imagine is that often people are trained to just think about, okay, well, let's say we're talking about race, gender, and just race and gender, two common dimensions that will get discussed in the military. Then people focus on, okay, what are the women thinking? What are the men thinking? What are the brown people thinking? What are this? They go through that whole process, and then they focus on how many of them do we have, and do we have them in the right roles and all of that. That's a lot of focus on diversity. So, but what you really need to focus on, I think, is leadership effectiveness. So if there's only one thing that anyone who's listening to this remembers, I hope it is that diversity inclusion is really just another word, another side of the coin that I call leadership effectiveness. When leaders are connecting to, interacting with, and showing interest in the individual members of their team, regardless of how those team members look, how they dress, what language they speak, or what their gender is, or whether they come from Kentucky or Long Island, they will develop the relationship so that that person will know that the leader is the designated hitter. There's only ever one designated hitter for every employee in an organization. So to the extent that the designated hitter is always focused on that outcome, he or she is likely to then get past this awkwardness that you were describing when they're just thinking of the person as a category, instead of just focusing on understanding what does this person need, and then how can I deliver that.
Oh, okay. I love that, because leadership is like one of the things I have a big passion for.
Yes.
So thank you for that. So now I'm going to ask another question.
Of
So
course.
this is educational for me is,
Yes.
what are these macro social forces that
Mhm.
you think may influence diversity and inclusion conversation in the near
Oh,
future?
wow. Frankly, they are so vivid in my mind, especially in this last year, since May of 2020 when George Floyd was killed. I think we have had sort of a seismic shift in the way that all of us are talking about these issues. So the factors, I think, are number one, we've had this pandemic raging on a global scale. And what we've noticed is that the human aspect of our experience is the most important. Organizations are now focusing more on well-being, mental health, resilience, burnout, and all of these topics that were kind of taboo because many of our leaders have been taught to exclude or push aside what they might call soft skills. Whenever I hear a leader use the words soft skills, I know that what they're basically saying is that they think that the outcome, the process, and the operation are maybe more important than the human experience. But what the pandemic is doing is twisting that and turning it around and basically saying, guess what? This human experience is now critical. So that's one macro factor that is influencing this conversation, because the reality is that the pandemic has had a disparate impact on people depending on gender. Women have been much more negatively affected, race, socioeconomic status, and other things. So when you're managing a team, you've got to understand that. Another factor, another huge factor, so I call that the humanization aspect of things. And when you humanize, this is just a natural conversation that would then lead you to be talking about, well, what are those different experiences and how can I support the people in my organization who might be different in a variety of ways? Another big factor is Generation Z. I love Generation Z. Now, I am one of those people who does not typically believe that we need to overly analyze the differences between genders. But Generation Z has come along and they're like, okay, we're here and we have a lot to say and we're going to say it and we want things to happen more quickly. So Generation Z, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, and all these other things, as a group, They're much more interested in these big social issues. So diversity, inclusion, climate change, how we vote, those big, big social issues. And they're basically saying we have an opinion. We want to have a certain kind of life. And we believe that in order to have it, all of these things have to be present. So they're talking about these issues a lot more than previous generations. And then the last thing is, quite simply, we are having different conversations. I am having more deep, meaningful, honest conversations on this subject with a variety of people, including you, Tara, today, as an example, than a year ago. We weren't necessarily having these conversations before.
So you just reminded me, I don't know if you ever watch it, but I watch Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee with Jerry Seinfeld on Netflix. And he talks about that on one of his shows after his first season. He got a bunch of feedback because he said he only had white male guys as his guests. And he was like, it never occurred to me. He's like, that's just who I hang out with. And so he actually has brought a lot more women and a lot more different people on the show. And so it's just interesting. I think it's easy to get stuck in your own bubble. And it's not that you're trying to exclude people, but you just get, we're creatures of habit. And so it almost seems like at some point you just have to kind of go, it's a little rough at first. And maybe you intentionally make the strides and then you go, oh, you know what? That's just a person. Oh, who knew?
Yeah. And that's the thing. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that one of the very fascinating things about our lives in this country in particular is that the place where we are more likely to encounter people who don't look like us or have our particular background is in the workplace, whatever kind of workplace that is. It's not in our schools. It's not in our grocery stores. It's not on our playgrounds. It's not in our libraries. So once we know that fact and acknowledge that fact, that we tend to live in a pretty segregated community, society, right? This is just sort of how it is, right? As opposed to saying, that person over there doesn't want to get to know me. I just have to accept the fact that this is how it is. But in the workplace, that's kind of like a playground, right? Because in the workplace, you have all of this. And so I think that if you really want to kind of bridge that gap, to me, organizations are just the natural place to make it happen because it's where the variability exists. And it can be done in a way where it becomes sort of par for the course and something that we all strive to do, and definitely not an initiative or a program.
I love it. So we're trying to have these conversations, and I think it's right. I mean, for good or bad, things are getting better slowly. We're having these conversations we didn't used to have. Yeah. So why do you find that employees of color, especially, are still saying they're just not seeing meaningful change?
Yeah, well, when you say still, I think that word requires a little bit of definition because what I say is still as in since when, right? So if you're thinking, you know what I mean? If we're thinking about this, as some people have asked, if they're thinking about this since May of 2020 when George Floyd was killed, then I wouldn't expect that in one calendar year, we would be able to make all of these social changes and change America overnight. That wouldn't even be an expectation. So I'm not looking at that. However, if we even took this just that year, there is no question that there are some organizations that are doing more than others. But if we took a longer view, which I think is probably a good starting point, the reason that you would hear that is that consistently over the last 50 years, what we find is that the hiring rates of people of color are significantly lower than the hiring rates of people who are from the majority group. The promotions to white collar and leadership roles are also significantly lower than one would expect just based on representation, access to these kinds of roles. And then consistently, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, Hispanic Latino employees, and Black African American employees report consistently more negative experiences at work. Mm-hmm. And those negative experiences are within the control of their immediate leaders. So the reason that you would still hear people say that there's not enough progress is that those kinds of macro measures are still not moving significantly. Today is June 24th. And since the Fortune, as an example, since the Fortune 500 was started in the 1950s, about 1,800 Fortune 500 CEOs have been selected. And during that time, there have only ever been 4 Black females selected to be a Fortune 500 CEO. 2 of them are in the job starting this year. So prior to this year, there were really only 2, and one of those was in a temporary role as a transition. So really only one before that who was a permanent CEO, Ursula Burns of Xerox. So there is a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of room for improvement. What's happening now then in this year is that we're having a new conversation. We're seeing those disparities for the first time with clarity. And now we're moving forward.
So, okay, that's a great answer. And then so my next question is going to be about leadership, but I wanted to share. So I took command of a squadron in Little Rock, Arkansas a few years ago, and meeting everybody, sitting down, we were having a Christmas party. And one of my sergeants, she said, if you would have told me 5 years ago that I was going to have a female commander, a Latina chief, and a Black chief, I wouldn't have taken that bet for anything. and I was like, wow, okay. And I said, so this is an important thing. So what can I do to make a difference? And she's like, just the fact that you exist.
Yes. It really, really. And so first of all, congratulations to you, Tara, on your career accomplishments, which are significant and meaningful, because the reason it's meaningful is there will be a little girl that will hear about you, see you. Someone will point you out in the grocery store in the most mundane situation, and they will say, that lady over there, she's a pilot. She flies those planes. And guess what? She leads a whole group of people. And the girl will go, wow. And then this girl, now it's in her brain and never to be removed that she too can do that, which is why you always hear that role models do matter when it comes to these kinds of things, because sometimes unless people can see it, they don't think they can be it.
Right. And it's interesting. This came up in the financial world. I had never even thought about it because I spent so much time in the military. Yeah. I talked about there's just very few women that are in leadership roles in finance. And so I didn't realize what a unicorn I am, apparently owning a financial business as a woman.
Yeah. I mean, there is just still that opportunity. And I think sometimes, to be honest, sometimes we, meaning women, have been kind of stared away from some things. They haven't been sort of providing to us as options when we were in high school, middle school. Nobody was talking about those things in a way that might even let a woman know that they were available. And then you see the data in STEM, all the scientific and engineering fields where we start out with the same level of capabilities when we are in elementary school and middle school in terms of our ability to work with these concepts. And then somewhere along the line, around puberty, there's this line of divergence where male students are more likely to continue on the path, and the female students are more likely to step off the path. And what the research is saying is that has something to do with confidence. It has nothing to do with capability. So it's a social construct, a social situation that we're creating that is teaching girls they can't be everything that boys can be.
Interesting. There's just so many layers of complexity. So the next question I wanted to get to you is you talk about inclusion strategy. So I like how you've pointed out diversity is almost as much of a numbers game because you can count it. But what is inclusion strategy?
Well, the word strategy is in there intentionally to make the point that, strategy is really a North Star, a guidepost. It's a thing that you use that lets you know what's important, what are our priorities, do we want to go left or do we go right? So strategy is all about guiding an organization to make choices in support of some desired outcome. So when I put the word inclusion along with strategy, what I am saying is that organizations must have an inclusion strategy, a strategy that guides them about what they will and will, the desired outcome or outcomes, and what they will and will not do and should not do in support of that. It's kind of like if you don't have that master idea, then you will do anything. And then when you do the anything, a year later, you're like, I didn't see anything come out of that. And you're disappointed. it's probably because you don't have a strategy. The other thing about strategy, though, for this kind of work is that it has to start at the top of the organization. And by that, I don't mean that the CEO needs to become the diversity expert or diversity and inclusion expert. I do not mean that. But what I do mean is that the CEO has got to provide some guidance to the rest of the organization about what that inclusion strategy, what the boundaries are. And then that is the only way that that chief diversity officer or chief human resources officer can do an effective job with this. Because if he or she goes off to do something without having that sense of how does this fit into the overall enterprise strategy, then there's a risk that it will not be effective.
Okay, so you just blew my mind right there because I'm a logistics planner, so strategy is what I'm all about.
Yeah.
and I'm bringing that to my finance business because I see a lot of people that are like trying to do IRAs or pick funds, and I'm like, but what's your strategy? What's your big picture? How do you know where you're trying to even go? And so I love that for the business. But Gena, I'm going to take that to my drill weekend and I'm going to talk because I usually do mentoring with my commanders. And I love that. What we really need from the boss is, what is our strategy for inclusion? Like it's not just something we talk about once for an hour every month.
Yes.
It needs to be like a whole strategy. It's not like just a task.
Absolutely.
So I like that. So it's this inclusion strategy. It's not like a task that we go, check, we did that. We had that briefing. It's
when you do that, that's when you realize 6 months later, when 6 months have gone by, you're like, wait a minute, I don't see anything different. And it's also when the people who you are intending to benefit from your actions say, well, they're not doing anything. Yeah.
Well, and so you just reinvigorated me too, because when Black Lives Matter was at the height of it in the summer, we had a whole down day and we talked about it, and we brought in policemen and we brought in lawyers, and we had a lot of great conversation. But what are we doing now? And so it's like you're saying, we need to make it more of an inclusive strategy. It's not just like we did it and then we go, well, what do we do now? So wow. Okay. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot for today. So before we run out of time, Gena, you are an amazing person. You do keynote speaking, you do consulting. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now and how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, I'm probably doing way more than I should. I tell other people not to overdo it, and then somehow I find myself overdoing it, but it's all because I'm so passionate about what I do. You know that I'm in the middle of writing a book. You are yourself an author, and so you know how much time that one must dedicate to that. So all the other things that one does to generate revenue, because the book does not generate revenue while you're writing it, those things have to still get done. And in that case, it's advisory. In my case, advisory services to leaders who are fearful and frustrated about this very topic that we're talking about. Often they come to me and they say, first of all, sometimes we don't know where to start, or they might say, we've tried some things and nothing has come of them. They haven't had the desired impact. And so what I try to do is guide them to the things that could really make a difference for their organization. So that's what I'm up to. I'm writing a book. I'm perfecting my keynote speech. A keynote speech is never done, as you know, Tara, right? So I'm doing those kinds of things and really just having a lot of fun focusing on my mission, which is to really help leaders of organizations get the results that they desire so that they can build these organizations where everybody in the organization can thrive. That's what they want. And I know they can do it.
I love that. I think someone brought that up and they said, one of the reasons that you should be inclusive is you're only as strong as your weakest link. So why would you want anyone on your team that's not working at their best?
Exactly.
It could be a totally self-serving reason. So let me just do a really quick recap. Gena, you've done some amazing things, but I love that you're saying diversity and inclusion should just be leadership effectiveness. This is just what good leaders should be doing. And so I think that should be really a big takeaway, and just be actually interested in your team. You don't have to pretend, just actually be interested in your team. Yes. So that was huge. I like how you pointed out that when you try to approach diversity and inclusion as a category, it's very stilted and hard. When you go, these are just people. I just need to connect with people. And you kind of start to remove some of the awkwardness and the barriers. And I love that. you touched on soft skills and through the pandemic. And I think that's a huge thing because I think, especially in the military, we can get very focused on mission. There's always this question: are you a mission first or a people first kind of person? And you're splitting hairs. It has to be both. And so, just getting at these soft skills that the human experience matters. You talked about that, and I love that. And then I just love about this. Having a strategy, like it's not a task that you do. Having this strategy to grow your organization, because you're going to make your organization stronger and better. And why wouldn't you want that?
Exactly.
So Gena, is there just one last, if there was one takeaway for people listening to the call today, what would you want them to walk away with? What image or feeling do you want people to walk away with?
Yeah, I would say it would be optimism, the belief that every person who's listening to this conversation has within him or herself the ability to contribute to building that world, that society, whether it's within an organization or the broader society, so that every person, as you walk past them in the morning, you can make that eye contact, you can say hello, and know that just that little action is bringing us a little bit closer together.
Okay, I love it. So Gena, just remind everybody quickly, how do they get a hold of you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, you know what? The easiest way to find me, first of all, is GenaCox, my name. And if you go to LinkedIn and look for me, you're going to find me there. And then from there, you can go to my website, you can read stuff I write, whatever. And I would love nothing more than to be in contact with you.
Great. So please reach out to contact Gena. She is amazing. You can see from today. Don't forget that you can share this interview with your friends who may not have been able to listen in today. And I'm really looking forward to sharing a must-know topic with you next time. Can't wait to hear about all your success. I will talk with you later. Bye.
Bye, everybody.